Welcome back, everybody, for our third week of studying migration stories in the book of Genesis. And we're going to continue this study throughout the month of July. You can see that today we're moving from chapter 12 to 13. Next week we'll fast forward a little bit more to a different kind of story. But as for today, we're going to look at the problem of wealth. So if you have any questions about the video, the study, the process, whatever, just contact us here at the church office. We'll be happy to get back to you. So let's jump right into it. We are now in chapter 13, and in the first 4 verses, we can see that the journey continues. So remember, Abram lived with his father in the land of Ur in the Mesopotamian region along the Euphrates River. His father, Terah, wanted to travel down to Canaan. They made it as far as Haran and settled there. It was when Abram was living in Haran, after his father died, I think, that God called him and said, leave behind your country, your kinship, your father's house, and go to a place that I will show you. So from Haran, Abram and his family and Lot, his nephew, traveled down along the coast into the land of Canaan. When they got to Shechem, that's where God told Abram, this is the land that I will give to you and your children. But he didn't settle there. He kept going. And he built an altar in Shechem and then came down and for a time settled in between Bethel and Ai. And while he was there, he built an altar and began to call on the name of the Lord. And then a great famine, a severe famine, hit the land. And so they traveled down through the Negev and into Egypt. And last week we looked at what happened while they were in Egypt. And that story ended with Pharaoh demanding his people to run Abram out of Egypt. And so today what we get is the beginning of the reversal of that journey as they begin to go north. And they first go back through the Negev. Now, the reason I have this spelled with the letter B in parentheses and the letter V next to it, or the letter V in parentheses, is because those two letters sound very similar in the Hebrew alphabet, and they can be somewhat interchangeable because remember, this was all given orally before it was written, and so even today, if you read something about the Negev, it may be spelled with a B, it may be spelled with a V. Interesting, I saw an article, it was written in 2009 by a man named Robert Britt, an archaeologist, who argued that the surface of the ground in Negev is the oldest surface on the earth. I'm not an expert by any means in archaeological history, but he estimated that surface may be as much as 1.8 million years old. So what we're talking about is really, really ancient land territory here. And so Negev, the meaning of the term might originally have been something like the south, or maybe even something like dry, because it's a rather rocky desert area, semi-desert area. So as they're leaving Egypt, they travel back up through the Negev. And then we hear that Abram is very rich. So let's follow this for a moment. We don't know how wealthy Abram was when he lived in Haran, but he seemed to be a person of pretty good means, because when he left to travel, we saw that he had, his wife and his nephew Lot, but also herds and women and men that he had acquired in Haran. So it means that he was not a laborer, he was a landowner, he was an accumulating person, and he had a significant entourage as he left the land of Haran. But then, when he was in Egypt, and he presented Sarah as his sister, the Pharaoh gave him a lot of more herd and cattle, male and female donkeys, as well as slaves. So now And when Pharaoh had him run out of Egypt, apparently Pharaoh had so much fear of the God taking care of Abram and Sarah, who can send plagues when you take Sarah into your harem. Pharaoh had so much respect for God, he said, just leave with all your stuff, go. And now, so having gone south, now as he's going north, Abram comes back very rich. And significantly, not only in terms of livestock, herds, slaves, and so forth, but also silver and gold. That's a new element of his wealth here. And then as he's traveling north, we revisit some of the places where we went before. And I think this is the writer's way of inviting us back, into the story of remembrance, and the significance of the fact that when Abram had settled for a time between Bethel and Ai, he built an altar and he called on the name of the Lord. So these are moments of, I would say, significant religious evolution. In almost every evolutionary process, there are hundreds of years when things are pretty much the same, and then a significant burst of time when real innovation happens. Something new arises. And this seems to be those significant moments in this religious evolution. Because, we really don't know how many people around that area are calling on the name of the Lord. We assume that they're all children of Noah to some extent, and we'll talk about that a little bit more on Wednesday. And there's an odd story in a couple of chapters about a king of Salem who shows up, and it turns out he's a priest of the Lord God. He's remembered in the book of Hebrews, Melchizedek, as a prophet and a priest. It's really kind of an interesting, out of the blue reference to a different worshiper of the Lord God, not just Abram and his family. So we have, it's kind of a murky religious scene, and yet within that we start to see some clarification of what later would be ensconced in the law and Leviticus and the practices in the temple as Hebrew worship. So references to the altars and calling on the name of the Lord, those are significant. And again, this is a repetition. And when we see repetition, it's for emphasis, right? All right, so we're heading back up, and then we run into a problem. And I'm calling it an economic problem, because economics is the term that we use. The word economics is actually from two Greek words, oikos and nomos. Oikos means house, nomos means law. So economics originally was the law of the house. You have to think a large picture of the house when we talk about economics today. But economics is about supply and demand. It's about the acquisition and distribution of wealth. It's about relationship between the owners of industry and the workers of industry, or in this case, the owners of flocks and herds and the herdsmen, right? It's about protection of wealth, and so treaties and you would buy a house, right? And you'll have to sign a piece of paper, and that piece of paper is going to be kept somewhere to prove that this is your house. You have this kind of elaborate network that comes with the establishment of wealth. So in verse 5, we start to see an economic problem, and that is not only is Abram wealthy, very wealthy, with livestock, gold and silver, but Lot also is rich. He has herds and livestock and herders and people. No mention of gold and silver for Lot, so maybe there's some clear subordination going on here. But here's the issue. Not only is Abram very wealthy and therefore has this structure of support around that wealth, Lot also is very wealthy, has a structure of support around the wealth. And the problem in verse 6 is stated and then restated. So again, we have repetition here, just like back last chapter when we saw there was a famine in the land, and a moment later, a severe famine. Now we're going to see the problem, which is in verse 6. The land could not support both of them living together. And that verse ends by saying their possessions were so great that they could not live together. So, last chapter, when they escaped to Egypt, or when they fled or traveled to Egypt, they were driven by a famine, a severe famine. So a famine is a sign of deprivation. Here, it's not deprivation, it's excess. That's what's going on here. And they're trying to figure out how this land can support the both of them. And theoretically, the issue is stated in verse 6 twice. And then where the rubber hits the road is in verse 7, because Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen are starting to tussle over what the land can provide. And that's either going to be grazing area or water. And they're starting to clash over that. So this is an economic problem. And it's a problem based on the fact that both Abram and Lot are wealthy. And then verse 7 ends with a curious statement that says the Canaanites and the Perizzites were in the land at that time. Again, this is the writers. This is an editorial insertion. Some translations put it in parentheses. And in some respects, it's just a reminder of the writers to the readers who are hundreds of years after the story that, look, while you might be thinking, we've always lived here, this has always been our land, it has not. At that time, the original inhabitants were there. And I think that's a curious thing, because in the next couple verses, it doesn't seem to matter. But that's a historic note for the reader. This land was filled with Canaanites and Perizzites. On Wednesday, we're going to talk more about the identity of the Canaanites and the Perizzites. So just hang on to those terms for now, and we'll circle back to that on Wednesday. So we've got the problem. The land can't support both of these wealthy retinues. So what are we going to do? And it's kind of interesting that in verses 8 and 9, Abram speaks to Lot, says, look, we shouldn't fight among us. You know, and Abram becomes very generous. Even though it would seem that by virtue of age, by virtue of the fact that he more or less adopted Lot after Lot's father died, by virtue of the fact that he not only has herdsmen but also silver and gold, so he's probably wealthier and therefore has more people than Lot, Abram doesn't exercise power. He doesn't exercise authority or control. He gives Lot the choice of where he wants to settle. And he invites him to just look all around. And if you decide to go to the right, I'll go to the left. If you decide to go to the left, I'll go to the right. So this is a very generous moment in Abram's story. And it's at this point that I want to raise an issue that I want to discuss with you on Wednesday. All right? First of all, we can look at these stories in terms of Abram's character. Like we saw in the first story when God called Abram to cut ties and leave, Abram responded immediately. And that just seems really faithful and powerful. But in the second story, when Abram was so ready to throw Sarah under the bus to save his own skin, at least that's how he put it, he didn't come across so well. In this story now, Abram's suddenly very generous. So on the one hand, we could look at the stories just in terms of Abram's character. But on the other hand, I think that the writers are less interested in Abram's character as they are in his faith. Because the storyline here is God has made a promise, a crazy promise. I mean, he's talking to a barren couple, and they are going to be the parents of a whole generation and a nation. So God has made this outlandish promise that only God can make, and So the questions are, will God keep the promise? And the next question is, will Abram and Sarah trust the promise? And I think those are the questions that are driving the writers. They're not so much interested in whether Abram's a nice guy and whether you'd want to have a cup of coffee with him or stay up, a long way away from him. The question is, does he trust the promise? That's the other part of the question, will God keep the promise? And so again, in the first story, Abram seems to trust God a lot. He just leaves all of his security and identity behind and sets out, not knowing where he's going. But in the second story, it seems like Abram may not trust God because he's fearing for his life. And how's he going to father a nation if he's dead, right? And it's out of his fear for losing his life that he schemes for Sarah to be presented as his sister rather than his wife. And so now you've got maybe Abraham not trusting. And then, later we're going to come to this story where suddenly Abram's like, pick whatever land you want, I'll be fine. It's almost like he trusts God again. So let's look on Wednesday about the relationship between this generosity and the role of faith. But then Abraham says something in verse 9 that really makes me wonder if the earlier comment about the Canaanites and the Perizzites, how seriously we ought to take it. Because Abram looks at Lot and says, look at the land before you. Look at the land before you. It's not the whole land before you. Just go live where you want to live. And that's a curious statement if there are Canaanites and Perizzites already living there. And maybe I'm overthinking that part. Maybe the land is so large that, lots of people could fit comfortably one way or another. But there seems to be a kind of an appearance and disappearance of certain themes. The famine was a big deal driving Abram down to Egypt. After that, it's never mentioned again. The Canaanites and the Perizzites are present, and we'll have to contend with them over the next few chapters. But in moments like this, it's almost like, Canaanite, Perizzites, who? Lot, if you want to go settle over there, just do it, and then I'll settle over there. And there doesn't seem to be any negotiation with regard to the peoples already there. I think that's something we'll want to talk about as well. I think there are echoes of this attitude in the doctrine of discovery that was part of colonialism, and so we'll save that for Wednesday. And also on Wednesday, I want to talk about how it is that Canaan and Sodom are described in the book of Genesis. Because we get a note that Sodom was very, very wicked. You get that in verse 13, I think it is, right? Now, the people of Sodom were wicked, great sinners before the Lord. In some respects, that's foreshadowing a story that's going to happen in chapter 19. And we get that. But also, in some respects, it seems to be a legitimation. And that's what I want to discuss on Wednesday, is if you feel like God has given you the rights to a land, how do you feel about those who are already there? That's a big issue. That's also an economic issue. Okay, so the solution for Lot and Abram is that Abram gives Lot his choice, and Lot goes one direction because it looks lovely. And the way it's described as being like the garden of the Lord, the Garden of Eden, or like the land of Egypt. That's what Lot chooses. Abram goes the other direction. And when Abram leaves, God visits again. So this is what, the third visit that we have from God to Abram. And God tells Abram to look around at all this land I will give you. And then a curious statement in verse 16. Count the dust of the earth. Count the dust of the earth. I'm not sure quite how that works. If we're thinking that it's mostly rocky, sandy, deserty kind of material, then maybe it'd be like the grains of sand. We often talk about how impossible it would be to count that. We probably shouldn't think about the rich loam of the Midwest or the clay soil of Georgia or something like that. But something about the dust of the earth there is countable. And God invites Abram, count it. I dare you, count it. And your descendants will be even greater. This is taking that outrageous promise that God made to Abram and making it even more outrageous. God just securing Abraham in the fact that while he can offer Lot the luscious plains over near the Jordan, God is going to increase Abraham's family. The phrase dust of the earth, of course, is familiar to us. It's the same phrase that's used in the second creation story. It's the dust out of which we were made. It's the dust to which we will return. So this is kind of interesting that the flakes of humanity, as it were, the dust, the dirt of human life. If you can count that, that's how great Abram's descendants will be. And then there's an interesting reference to the oaks of Mamre, and that comes up in verse 18. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And, one more time, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So the oaks of Mamre at Hebron. Mamre is the name of a landowner. And he will be a landowner and a neighbor of Abram's. He will factor into a story in the very next chapter when Lot, who has settled in Sodom, there's a war between the army of 4 kings and the army of 5 kings. I can't keep up with who all was on what side, but the king of Sodom was on one side of that war. And the king of Sodom's people, his side, was losing that war. And as part of it, the other army came through Sodom and pillaged it. And in doing so, they captured Lot and his house and all of his wealth. And they took off back toward their kingdom with Lot. Okay? So that all happens in the next chapter. And a messenger comes and tells Abram, he hears about it. And Abram, along with Mamre and 2 other large landowners, they gathered their people as an army. And so for the first time now, Abram's people are not just herders and travelers. Now they're an army. And Mamre and his neighbors work with him, and they go and defeat that other army that had just won this big victory, and they bring Lot and all of his people and the folks of Sodom, all the things back. And the king of Sodom comes out and thanks Abraham and wants to give him a portion of all of the things he's rescued, and Abram won't have anything to do with it. But it's kind of interesting that alongside of him is this person, Mamre. And I think Mamre is the one that will eventually end up selling to Abraham a cave that Abraham wanted to buy when Sarah died. So this is quite a few chapters later. Sarah will die, and Abram wants to buy a burial place for her, and it's east of the oaks of Mamre, and it faces the oaks of Mamre. And so this becomes a significant, I imagine it's a wood, a bit of a forest, signified by oak trees. And it becomes a bit of a shrine area because that's where Sarah is going to be buried, and that's where old Jacob in his deathbed asked for his bones to be carried back there and so forth. So this is all kind of an interesting geographical note that's going to play out in some other ways. So here's Abram. He's settling by the oaks of Mamre. So we keep seeing reference to tents, right? Nobody's building wood houses at this point, or stone houses, or clay houses, or anything like that. They're building tents. I don't think we can derive from that they're essentially nomads and they can pitch their tent or take it down and move it. I think these are probably fairly significant structures that can be carried from one place to the other, but also can settle. And notice again that Abram's settling in inhabited places near cities. They, just like Lot settled in Sodom, a city. Shechem was a city. Bethel, Ai, these are cities. These are not, I don't think these are nomads. I think they are travelers who are trying to settle. They're settlers. And one sign of settling there is that Abram is going to build another altar. And so now we have the third altar that we're aware of that Abram has built. And again, the establishment of religion is a part of the story. Okay, I have really rushed through these verses, and I've left a lot on the table for us to discuss on Wednesday, partly because as I was putting things together, I couldn't really tell how long it was going to take to rush through all of this. And so I'm going to end it right there, and we'll circle back and try to pick up on anything that was left unaddressed on Wednesday. All right? We'll see you then. Thanks.